So I recently conducted a shooting test between the Blackmagic Production 4K camera and pocket cameras, and I wanted to share the results. The thing that makes this test somewhat interesting is I use the same lens on both cameras, a Tamron 17-50 f2.8. And so I like that because it kind of forces you to focus on the camera rather than the lens for each one. Quick note as we get started, the format that we follow in this video is whenever we switch scenes, it's always the pocket camera first and then the production camera. So here we are with the pocket camera. So in this first test then, I wanted to test the resolving power of the 4K versus 1080p acquisition. The one thing I want to point out then is, as highlighted in the bottom left, is that tower in the back. It's about probably half a mile out. I wanted to see, well, how each camera handled that. So as we get ready to switch to the production camera right here, I think the first thing that I should point out is they did have a sensor defect in mind, so you can always recognize the 4K footage from that guy right there. But just on a general level, I was surprised when I got this footage back into the editor here, just how similar they were. I think the pocket camera does show a little bit more in terms of like color fringing and aliasing as compared to the production camera, again, right here. But just in terms of overall resolving in the image, it was a surprise to me just how close they were. Now, of course, the one thing that you can do with the production camera is you can zoom in a lot. So here's a 300% crop on the base of that tower. You can still see we're grabbing detail. And of course, on a 4K monitor, this footage would look no doubt better. And that's not something I would, of course, ever attempt on the 1080p source from the pocket camera. But in a 1080p edit, as we've done right here, again, the production camera, I think, is a little bit sharper, but it's surprising just how well the pocket camera did here. And so we'll go to the pocket one more time. As another test of that then, here's kind of looking a little off to the right. A lot of fine detail in this image here. And so as the pocket camera shows here, it's going to capture that almost as well as the 4K camera does. And I think the 4K camera does handle, as we'll see in a couple examples, motion better. But as we switch back to the pocket camera here, despite there being, I don't know, almost a little bit kind of more noise in the image, it's surprising how close, as we're looking at the production camera footage, is to the 1080p of the pocket camera. I do think the production has a leg up, though in some cases it's interesting that it's not as much of a difference as, again, I assumed it would be. But again, this is a 1080p edit. Moving on to dynamic range. So here's just a really blown out exposure where we're just looking at essentially chromatic aberration of the lens versus detail. Unfortunately, I didn't get the shot cropped quite as well as I wanted to, but as you can see here, the production camera is pretty close in terms of capturing detail in the back, despite it being very blown out in the top of the car. The one thing that I did notice about specifically the Tamron lens here, possibly because of the higher detail acquisition, is there's a lot of chromatic aberration on the top of that steering wheel, whereas on the pocket camera, you just don't see it as much. I think some of that had to do with the focus, but it is something to consider when you're looking at the 4K camera, that you really do need good glass to complement this. Now, as an example of kind of the real-world situation here of here's two cameras in a bright environment, just shoot. As we switch to the production 4K footage here, you'll notice that I just didn't get good focus on those trees. The pocket camera it's not super sharp, but at least they're in focus. The production footage here wasn't. And this really came down to the big screen on the production 4K camera being really bright, and unfortunately made it a little bit harder than I liked to grab proper focus. So for both of these cameras, as we'll see a couple times also in this video, an external monitor highly recommended. Here's an example of motion handling. So you can see here the pocket camera does a decent job with the motion, but when we compare it to the 4K right here, you see that the global shutter of the production camera just looks more natural. And again, as we switch back here, it's not terrible on the pocket camera by any means, but the production camera simply handles motion better. This is also, I think, a good demonstration of that kind of less noise in the image that the production camera brings. Even when I added a little sharpening here to the pocket camera footage to try to bring out some of the details of the blades of grass, it simply ends up looking unnatural, whereas the production 4K footage here, again, looks, I don't know, lush. It doesn't look as noisy to me. The other big thing about these cameras is moire and aliasing. So here the pocket camera has a good bit of aliasing and moire going on in that backpack, whereas the production camera has none. What was interesting about this, though, is as I was doing some test uploads to YouTube, YouTube compression simply removes, for me at least, the moire and aliasing from the pocket camera footage. So it is important to consider as you're considering your destination that sometimes these problems, like moire and aliasing and the pocket camera, will simply be compressed out, depending on where you're sending it to. In this particular test, I was keen to try the difference between using that beautiful clickless aperture on the speed booster to see how easy it made changing exposures, going from a really bright exterior to the interior here of the car, and also how well the pocket camera screen allowed me to dial in focus. So as you can see, as I shifted from the interior of the car to the exterior, it was very, very quick for me to just dial in the proper exposure. But I never quite grabbed proper focus here. And again, that's just because it was really bright and I just couldn't see as I was moving around if I was getting the proper focus. So again, something to consider. Now by contrast, as we switch over to the production camera now with the same scene, you'll see that even though I did the exact same moves, I was able to grab much better exposure using the screen on the production camera. And this is despite the fact, as you can see with the comparison here, that I had to kind of punch in using that active lens mount the exposure versus just dial the metabones. So it's not as smooth, but the results, as we can see here, are actually a little bit better. Now, of course, here's a big challenge. When I swing to look outside again, I have to change my exposure by quite a bit. So you'll see the camera shaking here as I'm punching in to dial in the correct exposure. But once again here, even though it's still too hot, you can see that I did a much better job, much more usable job with the production camera in grabbing a proper exposure. And I blame a lot of that on the better screen of the production camera. And as a direct comparison, again, here's that pocket camera footage. You can see that the image is just simply too bright here to the point where I wasn't able to recover highlights. However, one thing that really does strike me, though, is I think the pocket camera looks more cinematic, right? It's a more film-like image compared to the production camera. Again, that using the production camera second, pocket first, you can see here we're just going to do a couple comparison shots. So here's the pocket camera. Here's the production camera. What I wanted to do with these shots is, instead of shooting with really, really bright sunlight, just try to focus in on more still life things where you have a little bit better lighting, like in shadows and kind of diffuse light. And as you can see here, when you do that, you're actually able to set the tripod down and try to find correct exposure and focus. These two cameras are very, very similar. However, in some cases, like this one right here, the screen of the production camera allowed me to dial in a better exposure at the time. Whereas in other cases, I think the two are very similar. So here's the pocket, here's the production. Very, very similar in terms of the final image that they produced. This particular shot right here, I think, does a good job. It's fast, I apologize, but the production camera seems to kind of blow highlights out a little bit more to the yellow than the pocket camera does. In these next two shots, I wanted to see how each camera handled fine detail. So here, as we go to the production camera, I think you'll notice that the leaves simply look sharper against that really textured background. And the same with this shot right here. The pocket camera kind of mushes everything together, whereas the production camera really kept everything nice and sharp for me, right? Like the leaves, the edges of the leaves really contrast nicely against that highly detailed background. But for other things, more organic things, I thought the two were very similar. So the pocket camera and here the production camera, I think, resolved this image very, very similarly. Again, the screen comes into play here. The pocket camera did a really good job allowing me to focus on the building. The production camera here, even though it looked like it was focused, simply was not. And so in the end, I didn't get as good of a shot. Here's another example of that motion handling. So here the pocket camera does okay with that grass, but it's only when you see the production footage here that you'll notice that the grass simply moves more more naturally. In these next couple shots, I have a very, very textured building. So a lot of brick, a lot of detail. You can see here that the production camera, I think, does a better job of resolving the details on this building out. Here we'll go to a close-up of it. And again, the pocket camera, it's not focused very well, but even still, I don't have a lot of detail. The production camera does a really good job with grabbing a lot of detail. One area it doesn't do so well, however, and pocket camera excels, is with low light. So here we're both fully stopped open, and the production camera, as you can see here, is kind of dark, and at least on the ProRes has a lot of fixed pattern noise, unfortunately. As another example of that, here I've exposed for that bulb. As you can see here, the pocket camera is delivering a really beautiful image, I think, whereas the production camera here, again, exact same exposure on the bulb, is just really dark in the background. And if I try to lift that, I end up just bringing in a lot of fixed pattern noise and not really able to resolve a lot of detail. Again, going to the pocket camera here, you can see it's giving me a lot more latitude to work with. The other thing that the pocket camera does really nicely is handle overly bright areas. So unfortunately, again, I apologize, I didn't get the best framing here. But when we switch back to the pocket camera here, not only does it have more brightness in the background, it's got that really nice highlight on the wire on the top, which just kind of bleeds into the wire as opposed to just clipping it out. Here's another example of Morian aliasing. Again, the YouTube edit's just going to clip this out so you don't notice it anyway. Here the production camera has no aliasing on that speaker, but unfortunately it introduces some fixed pattern noise. Finally then, this shot right here, I think the pocket camera does a wonderful job resolving this highly contrasty scene, whereas the production camera, again, I had to boost it a lot to make it light enough, and even then it just introduced a lot of fixed pattern noise. Again, compared to the pocket camera here, right here, it just looks better, I think. The last thing I want to do then, before I give some closing thoughts, is just compare what a completely controlled scenario looks like. So here is the production camera that we're looking at right now. The production camera, by the way, is the ones where I'm looking straight at the camera. The pocket cameras are the ones where it's slightly off to the side right here. In this particular case, I think the cameras are essentially identical. And again, this is despite capturing at 4K versus 1080p. Now again, this is a 1080p edit. If you're going to 4K source, well, obviously that's a different story. But if you know that you're targeting 1080p, I think that this particular shot here is really instructive to see that the two cameras are very, very similar when we're capturing detail like this. So a few closing thoughts. A lot of what makes the production camera tempting are specs, right? 4K, Super 35, etc. The one thing that really surprised me is with the same lens, provided you have a speed booster on the pocket camera, you actually have a slightly wider field of view with the pocket camera as opposed to the production camera. So the talk of Super 35 and whatnot is nice. I mean, I'm a specs person myself, but in practice, the speed booster, provided you have one, really makes up for that difference and then some. It also makes your lens a bit brighter as well. The other thing, of course, is portability. I was impressed with the production camera's ability to, despite not having a nice clickless aperture, allow me to dial in both focus and exposure even when being outside. Though I think for both of these cameras, it is an absolute necessity to get a good field monitor if you're not in a controlled environment. And then finally, I think just overall image quality. The one thing that really impressed me about the production camera was its ability to grab kind of a cleaner image, but I think at the end of the day, the pocket camera actually grabs a more cinematic image. It's less video-like, if that makes sense. And for a lot of the type of shooting that I'm going to do, that's something that really attracts me to the camera. The production camera looks cleaner, but I think sometimes that noise actually almost works in the pocket camera's favor. And when you combine that with a greater exposure latitude and whatnot, it's a hell of a camera. So hopefully this has helped give you a better understanding of what the capabilities of these two cameras are. And hopefully others will be doing more comparisons like this, particularly with the cinema camera as well. I'd like to see how that guy stacks up to these cameras as well. So thanks for watching.